The sound of the front door shattering wasn't just a noise. It was an explosion that shook the entire frame of the house. Before Maya could even lift her head from the pillow, the hallway was flooded with blinding tactical strobes and the deafening roar of screaming men. "Police! Get down! Get on the ground, or I will shoot!" Sergeant Blake didn't wait for compliance. He stormed into the bedroom, grabbed Maya by the shoulder of her silk pajamas, and hurled her violently onto the hardwood floor. As she hit the ground, the wind knocked out of her. Blake jammed his knee into the small of her back, driving her face into the dust. He pressed the cold barrel of his service weapon against her temple, his spit flying as he screamed, "Don't you move, you piece of trash! You move and you die!" Officer Blake thought he was raiding a low-level stash house in a bad neighborhood. He thought the woman trembling beneath his boot was just another criminal he could bully without consequence. But what Blake didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine as he twisted her arm behind her back, was that the woman he was assaulting wasn't a suspect. She was the chief of internal affairs for the Department of Justice, and in exactly 4 minutes, she wouldn't be begging for mercy. She would be the one signing the paperwork to end his career, seize his pension, and send him to federal prison for the next 15 years. To understand the sheer magnitude of the mistake that was about to destroy 3 careers, you first have to understand the silence of the house before the chaos began. Maya Vance wasn't just a homeowner, she was the newly appointed wolf hunter of the state's judicial system. As the chief of the Department of Justice's Internal Affairs Division, Maya spent her waking hours dissecting corruption, reviewing body cam footage of police brutality, and handing down indictments to officers who thought their badges made them gods. Her office in the city was a fortress of glass and steel, a place where precinct captains sweated when they were called in for a meeting. But this house, this modest, single-story bungalow on the Eastside, was the only place where she allowed herself to be soft. It was her grandmother's legacy, a home filled with the scent of lemon oil, old cedar wood, and memories of Sunday dinners. Despite her 7-figure salary and the constant pressure from her colleagues to move to a gated community with private security, Maya refused to leave the zip code that raised her. She believed that justice shouldn't have to flee to the suburbs to be safe. On this particular Tuesday night, the exhaustion in Maya's bones was heavy and deep. She had just wrapped up a 6-month investigation into a narcotics unit that was planting evidence, a case that had required her to be ruthless, cold, and unyielding. She had returned home at 11 p.m., double-locked the heavy oak door, and activated the silent alarm system, a habit born from a job that made her many enemies. She stripped off the power suit that served as her armor, washed the city grit from her face, and slipped into the comfort of her sanctuary. As she lay in the antique 4-poster bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rhythmic chirping of crickets, she felt the tension finally bleed out of her shoulders. The digital clock on her nightstand read 3:10 a.m. The world was asleep. The air conditioner rattled softly, a comforting lullaby. Maya drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, completely unaware that 3 streets away, a tactical SUV was idling at a stop sign, its GPS glitching, carrying 3 men who were about to turn her sanctuary into a war zone. Inside that idling SUV sat the Street Crimes Unit, a trio of officers who viewed the Eastside not as a community, but as a hunting ground. Sergeant Blake sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through a warrant on his tablet, his eyes glazed over with the arrogance of a man who had never faced a consequence he couldn't bully his way out of. In the back was Officer Ruiz, a man who mirrored Blake's cruelty but lacked his intelligence, and driving was Officer Davis, a rookie who still gripped the steering wheel with sweaty palms, desperate to impress his superiors. They were looking for a stash house run by a man named Vance, a common surname in the district. They had the warrant. But in their haste and prejudice, they hadn't bothered to visually verify the house number or the surveillance photos. They saw a well-maintained house with a fresh coat of paint in a neighborhood they considered ghetto, and their bias filled in the blanks. To Blake, a nice house in this zip code didn't mean hard work or success. It meant drug money. He tapped the window with his wedding ring, a rhythmic clink, 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 staring at Maya's front porch. "Lights are out," Blake muttered, his voice thick with anticipation. "Let's wake 'em up. No knocking tonight, boys. We go in heavy." The breach was violent, unnecessary, and terrified the very soul of the house. At 3:14 a.m., the heavy boots of the officers hit the wooden porch steps in unison. There was no announcement, no doorbell, no attempt to verify who was inside. Sergeant Blake swung the heavy battering ram, the key to the city, with all his strength. The solid oak door, which had stood for 60 years, splintered inward with a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot. Wood shards flew across the living room like shrapnel. Before the echo had even faded, the hallway was consumed by the chaotic, blinding beams of tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. Maya woke up not to a sound, but to the sensation of her world ending. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a primal panic flooding her system. She scrambled to sit up, her hand instinctively reaching for the glasses on her nightstand, her mind trying to process the invasion. "Who's there?" she screamed, her voice hoarse with sleep. "I'm unarmed! Who is there?" But her question was swallowed by the roar of Sergeant Blake charging down the hallway like a bull, weapon drawn, screaming instructions that were impossible to follow in the chaos. Blake reached the bedroom door and didn't hesitate. He saw a silhouette moving on the bed and made a split-second decision based on zero intelligence. He tackled Maya before she could even get her feet on the floor. The impact was brutal. His shoulder drove into her midsection, knocking the wind out of her lungs, and he rode her momentum down to the floor. Her face slammed into the carpet, the fibers burning her cheek. "Hands! Give me your hands!" Blake screamed, twisting her left arm behind her back with enough torque to strain the rotator cuff. Maya gasped, trying to speak through the pain radiating down her shoulder. I am the homeowner. Please," she choked out. Blake responded by driving his knee directly into the center of her back, pinning her with his full body weight. "Shut up! You don't speak," he spat. He ratcheted the handcuffs onto her wrists so tightly that the metal bit instantly into the skin, cutting off circulation. Officer Ruiz stormed in behind him, kicking the bedroom door so hard it bounced off the wall. "Clear!" Ruiz yelled, though he hadn't checked anything. He looked down at Maya, a woman in pajamas pinned under a 220-pound man, and laughed. "Gotcha. Don't worry, sweetheart, we'll find where you hid the cash." For the next 10 minutes, Maya was forced to watch the systematic destruction of her life from floor level. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was calculating. As the shock wore off, the icy, analytical mind of the Chief of Internal Affairs took over. She lay with her cheek pressed against the dust, listening to the sound of drawers being ripped out of her dresser and dumped onto the floor. Crash, thud, slide. She heard the sound of her grandmother's antique vase being swept off the mantel by a careless baton stroke, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Officer Ruiz was tearing the clothes out of her closet, throwing her suits and silk blouses onto the floor and stepping on them with his muddy boots. "Look at this," Ruiz sneered, holding up a designer handbag. "How much dope do you gotta sell to afford this in this neighborhood, huh?" Blake, still standing over her, nudged her ribs with his boot. "Where is he?" Blake demanded. "Where's Vance? Is he hiding in the attic?" Maya took a slow breath, smelling the mud on his boots and the sweat of his uniform. In her mind, she wasn't panicking. She was building a file. Excessive force, destruction of property, failure to identify, hate speech. Title 18, Section 242. "My name is Vance," she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the noise. "And you are making a mistake that will cost you your pension." Blake laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "The only mistake I made was not kicking that door in sooner." The energy in the room shifted not with a shout, but with a sudden, paralyzing stillness from the corner of the room. Officer Davis, the rookie, had been assigned to search the top of the tall mahogany dresser. His hands were shaking as he pushed aside jewelry boxes and perfume bottles. Looking for the drugs Sergeant Blake had promised would be there. His flashlight beam swept across the wall and landed on a framed document. He paused. It wasn't a poster or a painting. It was a formal government commendation. Davis leaned in closer, squinting in the harsh light. Next to the document was a photograph, a high-resolution picture of the woman currently handcuffed on the floor, shaking hands with the President of the United States. And right next to that was a leather display case, sitting open. Inside gleamed a gold badge, heavier and more authoritative than anything the local police carried. The ID card next to it read in bold black letters, "Maya Vance, Chief of Internal Affairs, Department of Justice." Davis felt his stomach drop as if he were in a free-falling elevator. The sweat on his forehead turned cold instantly. He looked from the photo to the woman on the floor, then back to the badge. The realization hit him so hard he almost dropped his flashlight. "Sarge?" Davis whispered. His voice was so thin it barely carried across the room. Sergeant Blake was busy ripping the lining out of a suitcase. "What?" Blake snapped, not turning around. "Did you find the money?" Davis didn't move. He couldn't move. "Sarge, you need to look at this right now." There was a tremor of pure terror in the rookie's voice that finally pierced Blake's arrogance. Blake stood up, annoyed, and stomped over to the dresser. "If this is another false alarm, Davis, I swear I'm going to—" The threat died in his throat. Blake froze. The room went silent, save for the heavy breathing of three men who had just realized they were dead walking. Blake stared at the gold badge. He read the words, "Internal Affairs." He read the words, "Department of Justice." His brain tried to reject the information, tried to find a way for this to be fake, but the quality of the credentials was unmistakable. He looked at the reflection of his own terrified face in the glass of the framed commendation. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned his head to look down at Maya. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was looking up at him with eyes that held the cold, absolute judgment of the law. Maya saw the color drain from Blake's face. She saw the moment his career flashed before his eyes. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply utilized the silence he had created. "Officer Blake," she said, her voice calm, surgical, and terrifyingly precise. "You have exactly 10 seconds to remove these handcuffs and explain to me why you have violated the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution in my home." Blake stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The warrant," he stammered, the bravado completely evaporated. 10 seconds, Maya repeated, her voice hardening like steel. "Before I add unlawful imprisonment to the federal indictment I am already drafting in my head." Blake scrambled. He actually tripped over his own feet, rushing to her side. His hands shook so violently he couldn't get the key into the handcuffs on the first try. The metal rattled against the cuffs, the sound of his fear. When the mechanism finally clicked open, Maya didn't rub her wrists. She didn't scramble away. She stood up slowly, unfolding herself to her full height, towering over the kneeling sergeant not in stature, but in power. The predator had just become the prey, and there was nowhere left to run. The transition from raid to crime scene happened in the blink of an eye. As the three officers stood clustered in the corner of the bedroom, looking like scolded children, Maya walked calmly to her nightstand. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady as she dialed a direct line. Not to 911, but to the state attorney general. "This is Chief Vance," she said, her eyes locking onto Blake's trembling form. "I need a federal response team at my residence immediately. I have 3 armed intruders in uniform who have committed a felony break-in." Blake slumped against the wall, his head in his hands. He knew it was over. Within 15 minutes, the quiet street was ablaze with lights. But this time, it was the black SUVs of the FBI and the state police. The neighbors who had watched the initial raid with fear now stood on their porches in awe. They watched as Sergeant Blake, Officer Ruiz, and Officer Davis were marched out of the house, not as heroes, but as prisoners. Their badges had been stripped, their weapons seized, and their hands were cuffed behind their backs. Maya stood on her porch, wrapped in a robe, watching them be loaded into the back of the federal vehicles. The justice that followed was not swift. It was methodical, public, and devastating. Maya didn't just let the system handle it. She became the system. She appeared in the interrogation room 2 days later, wearing her sharpest navy suit, while Blake sat on the other side of the metal table in an orange jumpsuit. She played the body cam footage for him, the footage of him tackling her, the footage of his racist slurs, the footage of him destroying her home. She laid out the case: civil rights violations, assault, battery, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy. Because of her position, the qualified immunity that usually protects bad cops didn't apply. The judge, seeing the overwhelming evidence and the high-profile nature of the victim, sentenced Sergeant Blake to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. His pension was seized and liquidated to pay for the damages to Maya's home and to fund a new legal clinic in the neighborhood. The rookie, Davis, turned state's evidence against his sergeant to get a reduced sentence, exposing years of corruption in the street crimes unit. Maya Vance repaired her front door, replacing the splintered oak with reinforced steel, but the psychological cracks remained. She continued her work as the chief of internal affairs, but with a new, burning intensity. She kept the shattered remains of her grandmother's vase in a jar on her desk as a reminder. When she gave speeches to new police recruits, she didn't talk about glory or honor. She told them the story of 3:14 a.m. She ended every speech with a chilling question that silenced the room. "I survived because I had a badge in my drawer and the Attorney General on speed dial. But what happens when you kick down the door of a nurse, a teacher, or a grandmother who doesn't? If your integrity depends on who is on the other side of the door, you don't have any integrity at all." And as the recruits looked at her, they understood the unspoken warning. The next door they kicked in might just be the one that locks them away forever.